Welcome to the Jason de Sousa Show. Join us as we explore the evolving urban landscape, uncovering the trends, stories, and innovations shaping our cities. Thanks for watching and enjoy today's episode.
This is the Jason de Sousa Show with me, Jason de Sousa, and it is my great privilege to welcome Michael Zorbas to the show. Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jason. I am delighted to be here.
Well, you should be. You should be. So you and I have known each other a tremendously long time. We were colleagues for a period of time. You were a client for a while. Well,
that's true.
You know, while you've worked at most of the property companies in Australia, and now you are the CEO of the Property Council.
Yes.
The pinnacle of the property sector.
It is a great privilege.
Well, and you do it so well, I might say. Now, most people know you for your beautiful voice, but actually, you are actually one of the great property experts. Michael, how did you get into doing what you're doing?
I narrowly avoided a job in the Defence Department because my dad said, go and work for Jim Service, who just so happened also to have been the president of the Property Council. And so over time, I came to work for Peter Verwer, then the CEO, and then on and off through Stockland and Lendlease and other companies, and back to the Property Council again.
That's right, you were here before for a while.
Yes,
right? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. This is actually my fourth tour of duty.
Oh, is that right? Well, you know, a great schooling to become the chief executive.
Yeah.
And what is it like now being the kind of national chief executive? Because as I understand it, for the Property Council, you've got state divisions, and each is focused on state issues, but you're focused on the entire country. How does it work? Because you've got a large membership as well.
We've got a broad church. There's 2,600 member organisations and roughly the same number of individuals who are on our committees around the country. Very strong executive directors in each of the states and territories, as well as some specialist divisions. And increasingly, as differentiation in our market has become more profound, the need to have advocacy that is specific to different asset classes has been elevated. So we have a retirement living council, we have a purpose-built student accommodation vehicle, there's also a retail property arm, and all of these things have their own very sophisticated legislative requirements, and so we need dedicated resources on those in addition to general state and territory issues.
And is your advocacy largely focused at policymakers, or is it focused across policymakers and industry, or what is advocacy?
Advocacy is the sum total of our members' expertise and their needs for their businesses. How do they grow in a market, particularly in relation to investment settings, planning, and productivity? And productivity might include things like skill migration as well, because that's a big
we'll get to that.
driver. Yes, no doubt we will cover all of these areas. But that holy trinity is really what our members tell us they need. And it's pretty consistent around all the states and territories, at a local government level, at a national level. If policymakers, by which I mean elected representatives and the public service, are thinking about how do I make investment settings better, how do I make planning better, how do I increase the productivity of this sector through light touch, intelligent, performance-based rules, then we're winning as a sector. At the heart of our national strategy are those three very simple messages. We want better investment settings, better planning and better productivity, which includes that element of skill migration, which is absolutely essential to the future of this country. And without traversing any of the stuff that we're going to talk about later on, the fact is we've got a very unhealthy debate at the moment, and organisations like the Property Council, I think, have never had a steeper hill to climb on behalf of their members. You know, this is really an extremely fragmented, economically illiterate series of parliaments and parliamentary players that we are dealing with, who genuinely don't understand how cities are financed, how they are built and developed, and how they are maintained, unless they're actually plonked into those roles which have direct control over those things, like planning ministers, treasurers, premiers to some degree, infrastructure ministers. And it is such an area of, I think, deficit in our public discourse, that failure to understand that these engines of prosperity really do drive the vast bulk of our historically high living standards, that we really do need to push even harder up that hill to get the message across.
So I agree, and I think that's actually a good place to start, because I I know you've talked a little bit about migration, and I think you had an article recently that said mass migration pickles our national debate, which is sort of on the theme that you're on now. What is it about this migration debate that we're not understanding? So if you look at the UK, this is a debate. If you look at Canada, this is debate. You look at the United States, an obvious debate, particularly around illegal migration. I would say our debate is somewhat different. We don't have an illegal migration problem. We have a debate about legal migration and about the numbers of people that are coming in and the types of people that are coming in to meet ostensibly skills gaps that are still, after decades of a migration policy, not being met. So what is it about this illiteracy, I suppose, that is causing it, and what should we be doing better in terms of the migration discussion?
Migration is obviously a flashpoint and always has been in politics, and whether it's Trump or Farage or whoever, you're going to see that impulse, I think, over the next 20 or 30 years at a heightened level in a way that it wasn't so much necessarily for Australia.
What is it about this migration debate in this country that that we are not understanding in terms of, particularly in our skills gap? I think that's, to me, the most interesting part of it.
Well, there are a couple of really big drivers here. The ageing demographic is critically important. I think what we don't apprehend is just how much all of our comfortable old ages rely on people coming over to look after us in hospices, in aged care, in retirement villages. We don't apprehend that 59% of GPs are born overseas. It's an extraordinarily heavy reliance in IT that our nation has, and if there's ever been a time to be on top of IT, whether that's commercially for the prosperity of the country or whether that's from a defence point of view and keeping up with our Five Eyes partners, there is a real need to have the best of the best coming into this country. And we don't need to be worried about migration, because ultimately the splits are very, very small numbers, almost negligible, of asylum seekers and refugees. We're really talking about a third of people who are coming here to study, a third of people who are filling those skills gaps that we were just talking about, and a third of people, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, who have some sort of family relationship with the country and, are gradually going to be assimilated into our society. Those rough apportionments have been similar over time.
For a long period of time.
But 75% of those people are aged 18 to 39. And it's critical to remember that every intergenerational report that we've had at a national level, what the federal government relies on to set policy in the longer term, those 10 and 20-year horizons that we should be thinking about, says we're getting too old too quickly, our tax base is shrinking, and we don't have enough people to do all of the different sorts of jobs, from the unskilled through to the highly skilled like IT and GPs and so forth, across the economy. We cannot keep up with that demand. And yet we're now having a federal debate about reducing those numbers in some way, shape or form. No one's particularly clear on exactly where they're going to cut, but those drum beats are drowning out all the sensible thinking that needs to be had, because we actually need to plan for a country of 60 million people in the next 50 years. We've got to think about where they're going to live, how we're going to sensibly densify, where the infrastructure is going to go. Are we just going to remain big capital city oriented, or are we going to sensibly do polycentric cities within the larger urban areas? Start to think about the Ballarats and the Bendigos, where I come from, as part of a Melbourne continuum. Are we looking at the Newcastles and the Wollongongs as part of the Sydney continuum? What other large advanced economies have had to do as they've become larger? Are we even going to think about new cities? We've only had the Gold Coast in the post-war era really pop up as an option for people to live. And so what sort of planning is required for that? How do we then, fill in the missing middle in the existing conurbations to make efficient use of that, noting that's more expensive, by the way, than building on the peri-urban fringe or in a regional centre. All of that planning is the antidote to the anxiety that people have about large numbers of people coming into the country, which, again, chicken and egg, is absolutely essential to your and my health, medical care in our old age, our IT needs, and all the other services that are provided across, whether it's in retail, it could be hairdressers.
So I think a counterpoint to that, I agree broadly with that, right? The counterpoint to that is that first third you talk about, where we have consistently, since I served in government many years ago, have had 1 million plus Australians of working age on an unemployment benefit of some kind of welfare benefit, and those entry-level jobs being filled by migrants who have come on student visas. It seems to me that that is the area of concern in this migration debate, or is that just me being selective in what I'm hearing in the sort of media?
Look, I mean, I think there are always going to be challenges about what level of education you're hiring for. So if somebody does come from somewhere else and is a specific fit for a particular kind of work that we haven't trained our people up to do, that is a genuine policy dilemma. But again, it needs to be sorted out at the level of footnote policy, not at a headline debate about where...
I agree, yeah. But we've tried this for decades. So you've got all the job skills councils, you've got report after report. We don't have Boilermakers. I went to a factory in South Australia where they said, look, we'd love to produce more, but we can't find Boilermakers. They're all going off to work on AUKUS submarines, right? So we can't make anything else. So these are not new issues for us.
No.
Your comments on planning, I totally agree with, but largely run at a state level as opposed to a Commonwealth level.
Yeah.
So is it a disaggregation between governments that's causing
it's a buck-passing problem of the last 30 or 40 years. So Australia's post-war migration story is one of huge surges. The 60s to the 70s, a 20% increase in our total population. Now, admittedly, at a much smaller total number, Australia was able to deal with that more easily. But that was also a period of time in which, we put sewerage out in the western suburbs of Sydney and did a whole bunch of things that were...
Still going on now.
Yes, of course.
It's not complete, right?
No, that's right. Yeah. You're always going to have to try and find that infrastructure catch-up. There's no doubt about that.
I always laugh, when I was involved with the WestConnex motorway, as you'd remember well, when you were at Lend-Lease and I was in government. The marketers came to see me when we were doing the financing, and this is what we're going to do. And they said, we're going to present this motorway as the future. This is the future. I'm like, guys, the UK finished this motorway network in the 1950s, and we have a M4 that terminates on Parramatta Road, and this is somehow the future. What am I missing?
Well, they might not have seen Rob Sitch's Utopia, so
I've watched a lot of that now, and it's very, very painful. And
I've just been rewatching Yes Minister and Yes
Well,
Prime
I've been
Minister,
watching it too.
You cannot believe how prescient every single thing we are going to talk about today has been addressed before, and
absolutely.
And the themes are the same. So on migration, speaking of the themes being the same, these are reasonable conversations to have in perpetuity. They should never stop, but they should have safeguards and parameters around them. And at the end of the day, to reduce migration substantially is to reduce our quality of life. And to have done so at any point in the last 80 or 90 years would have done that to the Australian economy. Now, sensibly, we have kept on moving to the degree that our economy requires, most of the time in relative synchronisation with that demand. We haven't kept up the housing and the planning. And this is my big whinge, and I say this to all of our political viewers. This is said without rancour, but politicians have failed on housing in particular over the last 30 years. And that's because it was too hot to touch, because NIMBYism said we should only ever have quarter-acre blocks and nothing else, and it shouldn't be anywhere near me. I'm all for density as long as I never, ever see it in my life. And that really has restrained our ability to plan our big cities properly. So we're missing these huge middle rings that should be 2 or 3 stories in many cases. We're missing, the opportunity to actually house people appropriately across, regional centres, because we've always said, gosh, we better listen to the people who don't want their suburb to change as a priority. And then, of course, as the younger generations have become more and more disenfranchised, and when I say that, people are starting to rent now in Sydney and Melbourne into their late 30s is the median age in which you will finally be able to afford a house in those 2 big cities. governments have eventually got negative feedback from a new voter demographic that's come in, and the Greens have irresponsibly appealed to them and said we're going to cap rents and stop this and stop that, while also...
Because those evil landlords are stealing from them.
Yes, while also being the main opponents of productive extra housing supply.
We like dog parks, not houses.
In most suburbs, in Brisbane, in Sydney, in Melbourne for years. I mean, it's quite a scandal, actually, just how anti-development they have been, and therefore anti-supply they have been. And then at the other end, when there's not enough supply and the rents go up, they want to cap the rent. So it's a sort of magic money tree mindset where government's going to gold plate all the solutions to everything, but they'll actually really put the handbrake on the private market, which is just crazy because it's 97% of the solution.
And the thing that's most concerning is that they're putting that handbrake on in multiple ways. In regulation, in taxation, in rental caps, in building standards, and you add all of that up. I think one of your reports said that you believe 40 cents in the dollar is basically government taxes and charges.
That's a reasonably conservative number. So stamp duties, GST at the federal level, developer charges, infrastructure charges, there's a lot. There's a lovely diagram of about 60 different government taxes and charges that are all...
We'll put it up.
Sourced. Yes, we can put those in the show notes. But, are literally just the Eastern Seaboard collection of various things, and they're all, somewhat different from each other.
And look, the thing that worries me about that is you're looking now, so there's this whole debate now about, we're going to build 220,000 houses, and we've got this, more than that actually, it's 1.2 million houses over 5 years. It's clear that target's not going to be met. You can't do 240,000 houses a year. It's just never been achieved in recent times. Regrettably, one of the challenges for why is because of all of these planning issues and others, but also is the cost. So we have a situation in Western Sydney now where apartments to build them are running at 8,000 to 9,000 a square metre, but they're trading at just over 13,000 to 14,000 a square metre. So a developer can't make money at that level.
No.
So they don't start. So there are projects that are not starting.
A buyer sees the existing stock as being so much cheaper than the built form.
Because the replacement cost, the price of apartments is actually still below replacement cost, which is hard to believe when people think that stock is in desirable locations is affordable or too expensive rather. They don't realize it's below replacement cost. So you have all these new projects in new suburbs everywhere that are waiting for buildings to come up. I've been working a lot on Parramatta recently. You would think that Parramatta, where 2 out of 3 new residents in Sydney live in Western Sydney, that the demand profile would be so strong that you would be able to launch, and the infrastructure gone in there after decades of investment is quite strong in terms of, that you would get projects up there. But not easy to make money.
No, it isn't. And, that is the big challenge for elected representatives who come at you and say, I care about affordable housing. And the productive question, I think, for them to answer in saying that is, of that 40%, how much is your government responsible for? That is to say, were you to reduce your tax impact, local government or state government or federal government, on the cost of that home, could you not meet your own ambition and make housing more affordable? Why, yes, you could. Not all of that money, that $130 billion that is raised by all those taxes and charges around the country, is of course hypothecated to making that house in that community more accessible, that infrastructure, whatever else, and that goes to the fundamental need for tax reform, which is much, much bigger than just ratcheting up, what they've done in the federal budget, for example, and I know we'll get onto that. This is really about the Australian Federation having a structural deficit of, $50 to $100 billion a year, depending on, inputs and outflows, that will persist for the next 10 years unless we seriously have a look at what are the big lick tax changes we might make more permanently, particularly at a national level, which will involve states and territories. And everyone will then say, but that's politically impossible, don't even bother. In which case, you are going to continue to have housing taxed at the point of provision such that we keep people out of the market, because $4 in $10 that they hand to Jason de Sousa, the developer, is actually going to government.
Yep.
I mean, that is a crazy amount of money. That means you're getting $6 and that $4 is not going into that built form. In many cases, it's not going to the road around it or the sewerage or the whatever. It's going somewhere else in the consolidated revenue.
There's also a recognition in the community now that this level of taxation in our country is becoming a problem. And I heard Premier Minns, on some media channel basically saying, the level of personal taxation is too high. You work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for the government, and then you get Thursday, Friday for yourself. That's a state premier talking about national taxation levels.
Yeah.
The Treasurer, of course, then the Commonwealth Treasurer, that's not how marginal tax rates work. That's how people understand it, Treasurer. With great respect, that's how people understand it.
No. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to lowering income taxes, but you've got to, we have to be honest with ourselves. We are a country that has enjoyed relative prosperity to others. We have got there, rule of law, great abundance, a whole bunch of really serious economic reform, over a 20-year period, starting in the 80s and moving into the, mid-2000s. And we've been coasting ever since.
Yeah, I agree with that.
We're not having instructive and hard conversations with ourselves as a community. No one is saying, if you take this option, we'll be a banana republic. If you take this option, it'll kill jobs. If you take this option, we'll become unproductive. Nobody is really honestly having that debate in that negative way, saying we can avoid some of these traps going forward, but we have to make hard decisions now. And you look at, for example, belt tightening at the Commonwealth level.
It doesn't exist.
Well, more needs to happen. Let's be positive and say, 2 more notches in, thanks very much. Because 20 years ago, and admittedly, there have been 2 global financial crisis equivalents in the meantime, but we've also had commodity booms in the meantime.
Several.
20 years ago, we didn't have any debt, right?
2007,
right.
The then Treasurer Costello declared, I was there, debt-free day, right?
And we are a small trade-exposed economy, no bigger than 2% of the global economy. So we can't turn around to our people in 2 or 3 global financial equivalent crises time and say, I'm so sorry, we blew out, our bank balance in the big times, in the easy times, and we're now unprepared, in 2 or 3 crises time.
Michael,
we need to belt tighten.
Well, I agree. Totally. I mean, you and I totally agree on this, but I don't believe governments, and I'm not talking about just Australian governments, I'm talking about most developed market economy governments actually care about this issue, debt and deficit. I really don't. I mean, if you look at the UK, you have a situation where their actual welfare bill is more than they raise in taxes, and they're not doing anything about it. You look at the United States, which its budget position has blown out. Yes, its economy is going gangbusters, even though people don't want to talk about that part. But it is their debt position is very high, right? And that's because there hasn't been a reckoning. There hasn't been a reckoning.
We haven't seen an advanced economy that looks anything like us, with much higher levels of debt, actually suffer the consequences of those debts being called in, and then the shrinkage that would rapidly happen under those circumstances. So that may not happen, in the next 10 or 20 years, but odds on it's going to happen somewhere, and we're going to get a very, very quick wake-up call about what it means for us.
But also, I think countries that have defaulted have kind of continued. Greece, Sri Lanka, they have defaulted and they're still there. I mean, they're fine. And
Greece within the loving embrace of a much larger community.
Correct, right, which had to bail them out. But I think from our perspective, from an Australian perspective, what worries me, and your point is salient, is we have enjoyed the good times for a long time. Our probably mutual friend Eamon Fitzpatrick has a line that he says, there's only, we as Australians enjoy good life or better life. We don't think of anything else. It's good life or better life. And so when we look at our budget position and we look at the tremendous gifts that we give ourselves in our social services and our education system, and all of that is wonderful, we never think about how do we earn the money to pay for it. And we just, or what else do we need to give up in order to get these other things that we want? It has been a long period of time since then. And it's very, very hard not to look at the budget the most recent one, and not talk about it in the context of, hey, we want all this stuff, we better get more money to get it. And that is the reason why we have this whole range of new taxes. And we had said, and when I agree with you, that these things are political impossibilities. Negative gearing, capital gains tax reform were both seen as that. This government has proven that perhaps it isn't. And I look at it now and I go, well, I think it's fair to say in the market that it was a very big surprise that the government, the Commonwealth, extended these tax changes for capital gains tax and for, in particular, to shares and business sales. I just cannot understand why they would do that. So we have a situation now where we now enjoy the highest capital gains tax in the world and amongst the highest personal income taxes in the world, while breathlessly also saying that we should be a competitive, innovative economy where people want to grow business and invest in ourselves. And I made a comment on one of my videos while I was overseas that my hometown, Hong Kong, is 16% progressive income tax. That's a top. No capital gains tax, no land tax, no stamp duty, and a very low business tax. Where is it better to locate, Australia or Hong Kong?
Oh yeah.
And so it gets to a point where our standard of living and the beauty of our country might no longer be worth the cost.
It is interesting. I mean, I've got a great deal of sympathy for, the bones of the welfare state that we have in Australia being stronger and thicker than they might be in other economies. I will talk selfishly from my own members' perspective when I look at negative gearing, capital gains, self-managed super funds being extracted out of housing investment.
Which was also a surprise, right? Because super has kind of been preferenced up till that.
Well, I presume it wasn't included in any of the modelling that was done. It certainly wasn't flagged in the budget. And then, of course, the discretionary trust changes.
Yeah, which for businesses.
Well, which for business that's planned on one thing, and remembering that those were not flagged in any way, shape or form.
None of this was.
No mandate sought and no pre-budget positioning, which makes that original, economic reform roundtable look like essentially a large exercise in tax hiking, planning, and seeking a mandate to do that.
Yes.
Which, of course, it could never really, supplement what should have been, an election manifesto.
It should have. I mean, these matters should have been taken to an election.
Yeah.
And I think even the government would probably privately acknowledge that.
Well, perhaps. Certainly the modelling that's been done would seem to have radically underestimated the impact. I think there's a big difference between Treasury saying, in all likelihood, we will enjoy 2% less growth in house prices. And now the big banks are saying 15 to 20. Now, there'll be a floor under that, of course, because population will inevitably...
will catch up and...
will drive a rebound in those prices at some point. But in the meantime, what happens to your very laudable 1.2 million home housing target, and well done, in conceptual terms to the Labor government for actually, sticking a target on the table and making the states and territories join in, even though they're pretty cross about not getting more money for it. They've all got their housing targets and so forth. And we've never seen an outbreak of coordinated planning reform and zoning reform like that before. And it's all down to that clever targeting and planning. But why cut against that reform so radically and tax the absolute daylights out of the very property companies, particularly, small and medium-sized ones that are structured as trusts, in legitimate vehicles that they have planned to be in for decades, and a lot of that is about capital structuring and rolling in and out of projects and very legitimate uses. Why surprise bomb them from a clear blue sky at a time when you're already behind on those housing targets, and you can see that these markets are, being absolutely cratered around the country right now. Not a permanent state of affairs, but we don't know how long it's going to last. Why would you introduce new changes like the discretionary trust changes? Why wouldn't you grandfather those? Why wouldn't you, be reasonable in the context of hurting all of those businesses that are busy trying to make those FISOs that you were talking about stack
I look at them every day and they're not stacking, right?
And you wouldn't. Yeah. You just would not do that. So this is overreach. And, I said rather too kindly at the time of the budget, it's a wild roll of the dice. I think it's a very damaging roll of the dice because right now, project FISOs are frozen, new developments aren't coming out of the ground, and you're going to have this big gap. We don't know how long it's going to be. Is it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months in housing development in particular, which you just could have avoided by sensibly grandfathering some of these later changes. And so this concern, this real tanking of market confidence means that the sales suites of my members across the country are eerily quiet right now. Eerily quiet. People are not buying. They are worried about what's coming next and they can't tell. And I've got no guarantee that there aren't going to be more changes in the May 27 budget.
We can't because it seems now that governments will do these things and say, well, they're reform and they're necessary, so therefore we're going to do them, and we're not going to consult.
We've got to be very careful in this country not to confuse the word reform with more taxation.
Yeah, I agree. That's the thing.
And that is what is at the heart of this budget. That's what's happened.
Yes.
And so every time I hear Matt Comyn come out and say, I'm waving the white flag of reform for the government, I'm a big fan of what Jim is doing, I worry that he's actually just encouraging more taxation. And who knows, the next round of taxation might fall on the big banks, it might fall on the Commonwealth Bank, it might fall on him personally, and maybe he won't be so much in favour of that. But right now, the incidence of this is falling on, my members in particular, and they are the producers of new housing supply. So you've really got to be careful about how you specifically target each one of these tax changes and try and minimise the harm, even if this was the best use of our tax reform, political capital, which I very much contest, a broad-based GST with a better safety net at a higher rate, a much higher rate, it's probably well in excess of 15%, to be honest, is where you start the conversation. You can have conversations about how we extract commodities, et cetera, et cetera. They all have implications about investment from overseas too, so you've got to be very cognizant about that. But that's what reform might look like. This is just higher taxation in reality. There's a redistributive element to it, which is actually, interesting and worth talking about, but how this particular version of that has come out is going to hurt housing supply. Even the Treasury modelling says that, and it's been too conservative. They didn't pick this huge decline in house prices. I assume they didn't because they would have been honest about it on budget night. Surely tell me they would have been honest about tanking the market 15% from the dispatch
they
box.
did say there'd be a decline in house numbers, which I was very surprised, right? Because
70,000 homes,
That's right. So the narrative around the budget was that all of these changes, and we focused here on housing, but I go back to the tax on trusts and the tax on capital gains for business sales, which to me are really problematic as well. I look at the broader, and it was all tasked around this, well, we need first home buyers to be able to access housing. And you've seen members of the government come out and say, well, house prices are falling, so therefore it's more affordable for people to buy houses. And that's true. So again, providing a counterfactual wasn't that the purpose of these policies?
Well, the Commonwealth Bank's numbers from yesterday, 8.9% down on owner-occupier loans. So that doesn't seem to gel with those talking points.
Because they're lending less, right? And, I think the problem is, the reason why we're seeing some of these things, particularly the understanding of how trusts work, is that I don't think the civil service really understood how the property sector uses trusts to own development sites, to run development projects. Like, I don't think they understood all that. This is all done in the context of people are structured in trusts and they are paying out income to people on lower income tax rates, and therefore it's tax avoidance. So, I think there's a group of people in the sort of academic, institution, think tank community that see these sort of vehicles and say, well, no, this is just tax avoidance. We should stop that because these people are tax avoiding. They have not recognized that actually they're legitimate tools for actually managing risk and managing asset protection that accountants have long advised business to use to comply with the same tax codes that they were told to comply with.
Yeah, hence the shocking absence of grandfathering from this, and somehow now a confused discussion between, state and federal treasuries about who is going to help business adjust to the transition, because all the stamp duties, this huge lightning bolt of extra tax that's going to hit these businesses, no one wants to own the responsibility for harming, these productive organisations in this direct way. But I notice KIFA is meeting around this time. Perhaps they'll give us an answer on who's going to
maybe,
manage
and
the
so
cost
that's
of
a
the
very
transition.
good point you make around the fact that state treasuries are very unhappy with this, right? So with the fall in trading volumes in the property sector,
at least two
there's
of
no
them
stamp duty.
are on warning to potentially be downgraded as a result of stamp duty. So those are potentially, some would say, temporary issues that population will eventually, put a floor under. The problem is, again, the supply gets lost in the interim. There is a reduction in the volume of supply, and it probably ends up looking like more than 70,000 homes, to be honest, based on the severity of the downturn and the feasibilities not stacking. And the other element of that, and we haven't touched on it, but we should, is the cost of labour.
Yes.
And there is a real, it is a triple threat, really. The cost of materials, the cost of capital, as we've discussed, and the cost of labour. Now, materials, as we know, have skyrocketed, through the back end of the pandemic and up until now. And sure, the rate of that growth has slowed over the last few years, but they're still escalating.
They're higher than they were pre-COVID.
Yes, and in excess of inflation in some cases for critical elements of most building structures, whether they be residential or commercial. And then you've got labour costs, which just keep on going up. Now, there's something there, of course, about the very unhealthy relationship between a bunch of the construction unions who have operated for more than a decade on the very edge of legality, if indeed at all in legal manner, at the very top end over time. That's been temporarily suppressed by the administrator. And in Queensland, for example, you are actually getting, closer to 5 days work for 5 days paid for the first time ever.
We dropped below
in recent memory.
3 days a week at one point.
Yes, it was 2.7 something on most of those Queensland sites.
People don't believe that. People don't believe that actually Queensland construction sites were running at a productivity level of under 3 days a week.
No.
And
yet it was, absolutely universal experience across that CBD, and caused a number of big players to say, I can't afford to do, for example, high density residential here because,
can't build it, can't afford it.
You can't afford to pay anyone 5 days a week for 3 days work, regardless of what their job is.
There was a Utopia episode on that, actually. The Rob Sitch says, that guy earns more than a high school maths teacher and he's holding a stop sign.
Yes, and those numbers have increased.
That's right. I did find that quite
since that show was made. Anyway. Yeah, great show. But to that point, you can't have that runaway escalation out of whack with all other, wages and salaries in the economy, out of whack with inflation, out of whack with everything else, and expect that we can still produce new buildings at a cost that the consumer can afford. So this hurts directly the buyer of a new home, the utiliser of a new commercial office space or a retail shopping centre, and then all of that gets passed on to the renter, the tenant, and the customer.
Which all of that contributes to more inflation.
Yes.
And then
So we've got to get on top of that as a nation, or we won't be able to make the next generation of buildings financially viable or affordable for us as individual taxpayers and customers of businesses and renters in other people's properties.
So it's fair to say then there's a fairly big disconnect between the current policy settings that we're seeing at the Commonwealth level and in some states. In particular, I think, particularly Victoria has been highlighted recently with some of their policy positions, and what a lot of the market is feeling.
Yeah.
Right. So from a PC...
Can I also take you there, though, on language? So it's not just about the settings. Now, in Victoria, it's got a debt mountain. It's got, heavily corrupted processes around some of its projects, not just the big build, but more broadly. And there are really big questions there. Was it $1 billion worth of corrupt behaviour or $15 billion? Once it's at $1 billion, that's too much as far as I'm concerned with taxpayers' money.
100%.
So they've got these really, really big challenges and no particular plan for dealing their way out of it at the moment under this government prior to the November state election. But language matters here too. And what is critically important that we don't fall back into, and both sides federally have been guilty of this, previous coalition leaders and the current government has been talking this week about, barefoot investor commentary around landlords and this and that and the other. And that divisive conversation, as though the job creators in the economy are somehow your enemy and government is somehow the Robin Hood who is going to take money from them, and that's a good thing.
And redistribute it to the good people.
Yes.
The bad people will pay and the good people will get the money.
Which actually means take money away from creating more jobs and shrink the size of the economic pie. Yeah. That's the read-through on that.
But still divide it up.
That's been the rhetoric that has dominated Victorian politics under the Andrews-Allen continuum for 10 years. It's a hard left agenda. It was never announced as that. Government didn't come in and say, we're the opposite of Hawke and Keating. We repudiate Braxton Brumby. Prior to the pandemic, they had some control over their balance sheet. And I thought, we're doing an okay job on projects like level crossing removal and other bread and butter issues for Victoria, hospitals and education, which really should be where they should have stayed. They got into the pandemic, had a series of cabinet brain farts on an absolutely gargantuan scale, designed up out of the view of most of the public service the 20 or 30 year too early suburban rail loop, seemingly on a very political mandate, going through key electorates on a basis which would not necessarily have been designed by the public service. So huge warning lights there from the Auditor General, the Ombudsman, et cetera, over the governance of all of that. At the same time, the CFMEU in that state exporting its absolutely terrible menace ideology to other building and construction unions around the country. They've let all of that slide through. Construction costs have gone through the roof. Government's gold plating these huge and arguably untimely infrastructure projects. Even if you believe in the suburban rail loop, you think it's a project that's really suitable in 30 or 40 years' time when Melbourne's twice the size. So you're certainly sequestering, corridors and looking after land use and planning and so forth and so on. But that was a very big project to take on with a state that's got $200 billion and climbing in debt. They will be $10 billion a year in debt interest payments alone in the next couple of years. It's too much.
And the Commonwealth will have to support them.
So if you take a mindset into that, my general point being, that you are the Robin Hood and everything you do has to be gold-plated statism, which is a real repudiation of the clever governments of Hawke and Keating, of Braxton Brumby, and an absolute anathema to the Peter Malinauskas or Chris Minns or Roger Cook mindset, just to choose other Labor state governments.
Because they're not all the same. I think that's a very important point. Not all state governments, regardless of political party, behave the same way.
Yes.
So you do have a particular mindset in a Victorian context, for example, and how that government has been run relative to how, say, the South Australian government is running right now.
And so
they're the same party.
The Commonwealth, the Federal Labor Party has to remember that where Labor is successful, it's about growing the pie, then dividing the pie. Not dividing the pie first. It's got to be about growing the pie.
So I agree. I think it's fair to say that the current policy of the Commonwealth on tax, which has been to increase taxes substantially on housing, business, shares, any real path to earning.
Increase taxes where they have a damaging incidence.
Where they have a damaging incidence on the economy, which I'm not sure they agree with, but I think the market has spoken about that. The business community certainly does. I think the market more broadly does. From a PC perspective, what do you think is the next step? Because do you think, what are you advocating for in terms of things that should change in order to avoid some of the consequences that have been caused by this? I was going to say unintended consequences because I think they probably are. I don't think they wanted this. I think they have completely misjudged how the market would react to these issues. I think the civil service completely misjudged how the market would react. Not just on property, but in business as well. What is the next step?
Yeah. Once you stack on top of the neg gearing and the capital gains taxes and the SMSF stuff as far as hurting housing supply goes, and you then add trusts, I would definitely flush trusts down the
and
toilet.
they're consulting on that at the moment.
Yeah.
So there's a way out of
but
that.
that is just too much on top of everything else, and we're seeing the impact on market confidence, and therefore we'll see that impact on new supply. If they don't do that, then at least grandfathering. For goodness sake, protect those businesses that have gone into these lawful structures with every anticipation in this political cycle of no change. This change was absolutely unflagged, no warning, no business preparation timetable, et cetera, et cetera. You would have to grandfather if you were being reasonable. And then I think a policy mindset going into May 27, which is whatever reforms, I don't mean just tax hikes, that you're going to do. If you are going to do tax hikes, do no harm to housing should be the rule. You have already factored in a minimum 70,000 housing supply hit with the changes,
which relates to the whole migration debate we were talking about as well.
Right? Okay. Yeah. And so that's where you invite, real trouble for the economy, because we'll get to the next election. There won't be enough houses built. The Greens will come up with their magic pudding solutions for all of that, which involve, shrinking us down, to 19th century levels of economic activity. And unfortunately, on the right, you're going to have a really strong argument for housing supply leading migration, which will never fix all the problems that the intergenerational reports tell us are the absolute game changers for our economy. If we make the right decisions on the IGR results, on ageing, on skilled migration, we win. And if we don't, we lose. And we lose for the rest of the century if we don't have the right people, building what we need. And by the way, when I say this, think about the fact that over the last 20 years, well, at least until 2021, the 20 years preceding that, 1.8% of the people coming in from a skilled migration pathway were hypothecated to a construction job.
Yes, that's true.
It's a tiny percentage. It's too small. Now, that was, in some ways a problem of governments of both colours. But, I say this to the union movement, I say this to decision makers everywhere. We've just got to get better at bringing people in who can do plastering, tiling,
and
sparky
it's that
work.
skills matching part that I think we've always struggled with in our migration system.
Yes.
Right? It's actually matching those skills. We need these skills, these skills, these skills, these skills.
Absolutely. And we've got to use more women in the building pipeline as well. That's pretty hard when you've got the toxic CFMEU running work sites.
Yeah.
You'll find 4 in 100 people, going into construction in a lot of TAFE courses are women. So that's an unacceptably low number. Of course, we want to use that productive part of our workforce. Just need to get rid of the toxically bad and unlawful behaviour on work
And
sites.
I will add, I think we do really need to focus on people of working age who have the capacity to work, being enabled to work. I've always been passionate about this issue because a job is your pathway to success in life generally. I think if you are long-term unemployed, the sort of societal impacts of that are terrible for families, are terrible for individuals more broadly. And so whatever we can do to support people into work, particularly entry-level work, we should be doing. And I think that is one of the challenges of the migration debate. I think is and I know
how do we
give Australian people an opportunity,
existing citizens that pathway,
and it's not just Australia. It's again the UK, the same debate, right? The same debate in the United States as well. Like it's not. I keep bringing that up because I think our problems are not uncommon.
No.
They are being felt by other similar jurisdictions to us.
Yes, but I don't want to let our local decision makers.
No, I don't. I'm certainly not.
And here's why. Here's why. We're a small nation, so we can govern ourselves pretty easily. 28 million people puts us in the mid-50s in terms of global population size. We're somewhere between 10 and 14 in terms of global economic output, depending on how you measure it and when you measure it. But a rich country by all global standards. And at the same time, we've got this huge landmass. Now, not all of it's productive, but it is still the 6th largest physical entity on Earth as far as nation states go. Wow, those are some big advantages.
Yes.
And so when you say, yes, this debate is happening elsewhere, these countries have a much worse starting position than we do.
100%.
They've got greater wealth disparity, they're often smaller in physical landmass, or they've got much higher populations. So I'm not going to let all those local politicians of ours at any of the three levels of government off the hook in the way that you might accidentally do if you said, well, everyone's going through these debates. Because we have advantages, radical land advantages, relative wealth advantages, and a low population advantage that makes us easily governable. This is not a difficult country to run by global standards. Plus, we're safe, secure, and a long way from anyone who wishes to do us harm.
This is what I pitch to investors normally, right? Although it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so when the taxation rates here keep adjusting by surprise. I want to be very clear to our viewers and listeners as well that I endorse completely that message. But so we're running out of time. I do want a quick round of rounds on property
as you wish.
Quickly, which is let's go to office.
Sure.
So pandemic obviously very challenging for office. I think we're starting to see a lot of trading of prime office, which is great, but being C grade sort of more difficult. What are you seeing?
And just for your viewers, 10.2% in that premium CBD, that vacancy's going down, and that's an attractive story for the next 5 years.
That's and even those states like our Victorian friends who were trying to legislate work from home, the new premier all of a sudden has kicked that down till after the election, even though the opposition supports it. I do think that's a sign that people are recognizing now that this forcing of a legislative right of working from home is actually has severe economic will damage the economy. I think they're seeing that. So I think that's a highly positive thing. What are you seeing in office in terms of the movement of buildings? What are your members seeing in terms of owners of being?
Look, I mean, I know, when you're talking to me about that, you're also thinking about what does adaptive reuse look like?
Yes,
and all
right.
those.
So Brisbane's doing a commercial building into student housing, for example. Right.
Yeah. And I think there's a real opportunity there with old stock, but it's a very specific kind of old stock. So if you think about moving from, say, an office to living sector usage, you still need for the living sector a lot of light, and you need a lot of ventilation. And so some of the big floor plates and more modern buildings are, for ceiling height reasons and light reasons and whatever else, quite hard to repurpose. If you go back pre-1990s, you get a lot of big bone buildings that have some attractive features. So in the Melbourne CBD, we did a bit of work with Hassels a few years ago, and Ethos Urban, as they were then, now Colliers, to look at these pre-1990 buildings with the right bones for adaptive reuse. And we found that about 6.5% of those were particularly suited to adaptive reuse. And that would have been around about 10 or 11,000 new dwellings that are available potentially in the Melbourne CBD, those buildings to be redeveloped and easily, a high amenity residential outcome in those circumstances. So that's the sort of exercise that CBD should be going through and thinking about where you can.
And are you finding that cities are having that conversation?
To a degree, but again, labour costs, built form costs, very high.
Because refurb costs are through the roof, right? Really, really expensive.
So then, you've got to balance that out a bit on the feasibility. But there is a certain sweet spot, I guess, of these buildings that are very amenable to that change, and others not so, by virtue of design and, again, light in particular.
And so are building owners worried about not being able to convert buildings if they're finding vacancies in B and C a bit high?
Yeah. I think so too. I think there is, and some owners are probably caught there in that asset-rich, cash flow poor scenario where without high levels of tenancy, they don't have the money to roll into CapEx straight away.
And of course, there's very few new builds happening, again, because the replacement cost is below the cost of a new building.
Yeah. So depends on how dire the situation is there for those owners in that scenario. But you can see a need for government to think about what are the sort of incentives that are required, to tip people into activity in that policy.
And then you add that whole embedded carbon discussion into it as well. And
which is highly advantageous. I mean, who doesn't want to minimise it?
Of course,
carbon usage.
Of course. But then empty buildings aren't great either. So there's a debate about that.
Yeah.
What about data centers? Let's go to data centers. What are your thoughts on that? So the large influx of data center capital, lots of increasing demand. There's a belief that Australia is a good place to locate data centers for all the reasons we talked about, safe, secure, access to Asia. But increasing societal concern about where data centers are located, energy use. I think the Commonwealth Energy Minister said they should only be powered by renewable energy, which is somewhat difficult given power prices. What are your thoughts there?
Wonderful opportunity. I think clever leaders like Malinauskas show the way, address people's concerns. Be a lightning rod through that Royal Commission for all the things that people might be concerned about. Formulate policy that's responsive to that while still encouraging the absolute necessity of the 130 billion or 150 billion, of spend that's coming very quickly. And know that the future defence of this country is absolutely inalienably linked to our Five Eyes, to our big data integration, with America in particular, and all of the commercial and other elements of that. We can either be bystanders about the data change that's coming, or we can be involved in supplying some of that. That gives us the defence benefit, which is massive, and the integration, with the American alliance and the Five Eyes alliance, which is radically important. But it also puts us as a job creator in the value chain.
Yes.
And actually, in its initial phase, concerns about AI were overblown in terms of job impacts, in terms of where and how those jobs might be impacted, and how retrainable the people that are being impacted at the moment are. And the answer turns out to be call centres and other areas where people are able to be reskilled relatively rapidly into other parts of the economy. So it's actually been a comparatively good news story in the scheme of things, next to the Armageddon forecasts. So I'm hugely optimistic that the Malinauskas model, which is listen carefully to the population and reasonably and intelligently respond to their needs and create jobs here off this revolution, is the way to go. And anyone who's deviating from that or making it too hard for this investment to come here is harming our economic prosperity, but is also slowing down our ability to integrate properly in what will be the modern, defence landscape of the 21st century, that cyber capability.
I agree totally. And I think we've got so much opportunity for our country to lead in this space if we want it. I'll give you one final thought.
Great.
Before I let you go. So if you had one message that you want to give to our viewers, to Australia, what would that be?
What a wonderful question. I've got so many messages. Don't be afraid of migration. It has been the thing that defines the very best of us and underpins all of our prosperity since the Second World War.
Michael, it's been a real honour having you on the show. I hope you'll come back, because I think we only just scratched the surface on what was a wide-ranging discussion. Michael Zorbas, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason.